Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the role of the United Nations Secretary General? How did the seventh Secretary General, namely Kofi Annan, fulfill his responsibilities to promote international peace, encourage economic and social development, and enhance human rights around the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program today. Today we're looking at the role of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and in particular the role of Kofi Annan when he served for 10 years as Secretary General. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Jean Krasno. Dr. Krasno is a distinguished fellow in international security studies at Yale University, where she has taught courses on the United Nations, UN peacekeeping, and international organizations since 1995. She is also a full-time member of the faculty as a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the City College of New York. Dr. Krasno has been authorized by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to organize his papers for publication, a project housed within the Colin Powell Center. She was executive director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System from 1998 to 2003, when the organization was housed at Yale. Dr. Jean Krasno, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to talk about Kofi Annan, but before we get into that, let's talk in general terms. The United Nations is an organization that touches the lives of all 7.2 billion people around the world with its various programs to help move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information, has peacekeepers. But what is the role of the CEO, the person who sort of coordinates the United Nations system, the Secretary General?
Well, now, today, we look at the Secretary General as being the symbol of the UN, so the presence of the UN, the personality of the UN as an organization. But when the UN was created in 1945, the founders of the UN really thought of the Secretary General really as an administrator. So if you look at the Charter and what is written in the Charter in terms of the way the founders thought about the Secretary General is really as an administrator to run the Secretariat and have it run smoothly. But each Secretary General, as they came along, began to see their role evolve. And while there's one part in the Charter that opens that little window for a political role, Article 99, which says that the Secretary General can bring an issue before the Security Council if the Secretary General considers this an important issue and a threat to international peace and security. That was the only little window in the Charter, but each Secretary General has opened that window farther and farther and has become more of a participant in the political affairs of the UN. But we have to remember that the Secretary General himself, or herself hopefully, does not have a budget, does not have a military, and the real power is vested in the Security Council, and to some degree more and more in the General Assembly. So he has to really follow their instructions. But nevertheless, there are certain things that the Secretary General can take on as the moral authority of the UN, and Kofi Annan was particularly keen to do that, to become the moral authority of the UN.
And as you mentioned, that window was opening. Of course, Ban Ki-moon, the current Secretary General, the 8th Secretary General, has been a very active person as far as promoting climate change and a variety of other important issues. Kofi Annan was highly visible, was very active in a variety of different areas, and that's what we're going to talk about now. You took on a project, the Collected Papers of Kofi Annan project, and I have one book here. This is, or one part of it, I think, are 4, is that correct?
There's five volumes.
Okay,
it's 5,000 pages.
5,000 pages. What was the purpose of taking on this particular project?
Well, the history of that is that I had worked with Perez de Cuellar on collecting his papers. Really, that project was for him to write his memoirs. And I worked with Jim Sutherland, who I believe you know, on that. So I was just a research assistant, but I really did understand at that point the value of these papers. And I also did learn at that point that if you don't do something with the Secretary General's papers, that they go into UN archives and then they're locked up in UN archives for 20 years. And then even after that 20 years, you have to know exactly what it is that you want. So when it came time to think about Kofi Annan's papers, I thought this 10-year period is such an important period with the transition from the Cold War, much greater focus on human rights, humanitarian intervention. All of these issues became so important to the rest of the world that something had to be done so that his papers were not just hidden. So I wrote a letter to his office asking for his permission to do this, because I did understand from previous work that legally the only thing you had to do was to get the Secretary General's permission to release the papers. So we worked on that. It took a few years to get his permission, but we did. And he, being a very transparent person, was very keen to have the papers available to people. So they include speeches, press conferences, what we call off the cuff, if he's coming into the building and some member of the press interviews him, some things from the spokesman's office, the noon briefings, interviews with him, articles that he had written. But also what I was particularly interested in is the internal memos that went between his office and peacekeeping and political affairs and the legal office and various different, entities, so that we could see what was coming into him. He would always mark these memos up, write handwritten notes on them, and that response back and forth was so important. And that's something new that people had not done with papers in the past. So that's in there, with his handwritten notes.
Now, he was involved in a wide range of really very important operations and initiatives within the United Nations system that are still operating today, and we're going to get into them in a minute. But is there one thing that jumps out at you as you were getting into this project, as you thought maybe was going to happen that didn't happen, or maybe it did happen? That could also be the case. Is there one particular thing? Like I say, there are so many different items we could touch upon.
Well, I'm not sure what I would say about what didn't happen. I do know that when he first came into office, one of the things that he said to the people around him was that he wanted to have the UN come back to the people, we the peoples of the UN, and to take up issues that had been what he considered somewhat neglected through the history of the UN and bring them forward. Things like addressing issues of poverty, working with the business community, dealing with humanitarian intervention. We had witnessed Rwanda, Bosnia under Boutros-Ghali. This was a big concern, and he wanted to bring this forward and actually think about what kinds of policies should the UN have on these kinds of issues. And you see in the papers, which is kind of nice, just right away, he starts these letters that he writes to the International Chamber of Commerce, basically, and says, we need to talk. We need to be more involved with the business community around the world. Let's meet. So you see that letter. You also see his interest in transparency. He was extremely frustrated, I have to say, with the lack of transparency under Boutros-Ghali, and that affected the whole Secretariat. And one of the issues was that Boutros-Ghali had said that only he, Boutros-Ghali, or one of his advisors could ever take an issue to the Security Council. And this was part of the problem in the Rwanda case, is that nobody else could take an issue, and if they weren't going to, nobody else could. So you see within the first few days that Kofi Annan comes into office, he says, you as the head of political affairs are the expert on this issue, you're going to make the presentation to the Security Council. So dramatically changing the policy. And then within 2 or 3 weeks, you still see, like in January of 1997, you see another memo where he says the policy will be that the person who has the greatest information and expertise on this particular problem is the one that's going to make the presentation to the Security Council. So he opens that up. He has much greater transparency and a much bigger sense of teamwork, you know, amongst the different departments.
Now, of course, one of the most dramatic and most important efforts and initiatives he undertook was in regard to the Millennium Development Goals.
Right.
If we think back to 2000, I guess it was about 187 members or states of the United Nations General Assembly came together, and of course it was right around September 21st when they rang the peace bell. Kofi Annan rang the peace bell at the United Nations, and then they launched the Millennium Development Goals Summit, and of course out of that summit came 8 logical, practical, measurable goals to reduce abject poverty by 50% by 2015, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women, to reduce infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, to combat the AIDS epidemic that was going on, to promote sustainable development, and also to encourage international cooperation. How important are those 8 Millennium Development Goals, and why was it so important to galvanize the world to focus on 8 logical goals that they could attack and work on over the next 15-year period?
Well, as soon as Kofi Annan came into office, what he wanted to do was to address issues of poverty. That was going to be one of his greatest priorities. And so, as you'll see, for the most part, these 8 Millennium Development Goals deal with addressing issues of poverty or those things that will affect poverty, education, and so forth. So he was thinking about this from the very beginning. And then when they were planning for the millennium, you know, they planned like 1.5 years, 2 years ahead. He said, this is what I want to do. I don't want the millennium to just be a party. I don't want it to just be a celebration. We have to think about how to use this important date to plan a future for the UN's role, an important role, something for the people. And that is when they began to think about, well, okay, well, what are the most important things we need to cover? And then in the year 2000, when they launched that, you know, it was a part of the declaration. As they approached the 2005, the 60th anniversary of the UN, they said, look, the Millennium Development idea is good, but it's too broad, it's too cumbersome. So we need to bring it down to 8 very, very clear, precise goals with benchmarks and so forth. So that was why they looked at that again and reorganized it and then came out with the very clear 8 goals.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'll be back in just a moment after this important message. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, and some of his initiatives and various approaches to dealing with international problems. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Jean Krasno, who is a distinguished fellow at International Security Studies at Yale University, where she's taught courses on the United Nations, UN peacekeeping, and international organizations since 1995. Dr. Krasno has been authorized by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to organize his papers for publication, a project housed within the Colin Powell Center. Jean, we're talking about Kofi Annan and some of the initiatives that he launched. The Millennium Development Goals obviously are still very much in play today, and they've galvanized a large part of the world, not only the 193 countries at the UN, but also many non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups, just on across the board, service groups, service clubs. But let's move to another area that's very important very briefly, and that is reform in the UN. We hear a lot of discussion about how to reform the United Nations, how to make it a more effective and a more efficient organization. When he came in with a two-track approach, and that has, of course, continued to a large degree today. So over the last 16 years, really, there's been quite a transition, quite a change as far as reforming the United Nations. How important was that, and what were a couple of his ideas as far as making the UN a more efficient organization?
Well, when you speak about UN reform, there's two ways of looking at it. And often people argue about UN reform, and they're coming at it from a very different angle, and their conversations cross over each other. One kind of reform is to make the UN more efficient, as you said. The other kind of reform is to make the UN more democratic, more representative of the world as a whole. So you have reform in terms of the bodies of the UN, Security Council reform, expanding or changing the Security Council to reflect the world and the world powers as they are today, changing how we review human rights and those kinds of things. And then there's the issue of being more efficient and living within your budget. So depending on what side of the fence you're on, you're talking about that kind of reform. But I think with Kofi Annan, he tried to look at both and to merge those things. So he, created the Peace Building Commission, because he really felt what we're looking at today now is very different than 50 years ago. We're looking at civil wars. We're looking at conflicts that are between non-governmental organizations, or guerrilla groups that cross borders. And so it's much more difficult to resolve these issues and these conflicts. So we need to have the UN get in on the ground and stay there, and really begin to take a look at and study as you go, getting feedback, seeing what works. So the Peace Building Commission is, the work of that group is extremely important. Reforming the Human Rights Commission to become the Human Rights Council was a good idea. It hasn't necessarily fulfilled the aspirations that the Secretary General had. But in terms of efficiency, he really worked very, very hard to make sure that everybody was working on a merit basis. He also wanted the different departments to work together. And so he set up a kind of cabinet, which had not really existed before. And he had the heads of the various departments, peacekeeping, political affairs, humanitarian affairs, as well as key agencies, meet on a regular basis and take a look at a particular problem and how these different departments looked at that problem from different perspectives, and then work in common on a solution. So that's a kind of efficiency in a political sense, and then of course there's always the budgetary sense and staying within the budget. And they did a really good job of that.
Bringing management principles into the United Nations.
Because he has a master's degree from MIT in management.
Exactly.
And then he put it to good use.
Right. You mentioned peace building also. That is so important, because in the past we've seen what happens when the fighting stops, and so often you have the major powers involved in various countries, and we saw what happened in Afghanistan. Once the Soviets pulled out, there was a vacuum left there.
Right.
And of course, if the players, the key players, don't stay involved to help the people develop their own countries, their own forms of government and what have you, democratically set up or arranged or however they want to do it, then you have chaos so often.
Right.
And of course, the Peace Building Commission provides that bridge to work with all of the parties, to bring them together, to overcome any differences they might have so that they can move forward in a peaceful manner. But it's very important that, I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk a little bit about the Kofi Annan's greatest disappointment. I remember I've heard him say at least on one or two occasions that his greatest disappointment was not halting the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Yeah. How did that register with him, and what did he think he could do to help people better understand that Saddam Hussein may have been a nuisance, he may have been a threat within his country, but he was certainly not harboring weapons of mass destruction, and that it probably the most logical approach was not to invade Iraq. But how did he react to that?
Well, it's a very complicated issue. From our perspective, and I was working with Jim Sutherland on a whole issue of UNSCOM, the UN Special Commission to do the inspections in Iraq, and we had come out with our book on that just a few months before the invasion in 2003. So our view was let the inspectors do their work, because they're the experts and they've been there for years. They know where everything is, where the paperwork is. They've already destroyed, you know, most of it from our perspective, and really Kofi Annan, being on the inside, knew that as well, and it was extremely frustrating for him to be watching this and seeing the U.S. and a few other countries just preparing to go to war when we didn't really see the evidence that that was the best road to take. And it was very, very hard for him, because the Secretary General has to represent all the countries, you know, within the UN, and really has to be very careful about not being seen as being partial toward one of the major powers like the Permanent Five, nor to be an antagonistic to the Permanent Five. He had seen what had happened with Boutros Ghali, who was very antagonistic with the U.S. and wasn't elected to a second term. So he hoped that these things would get worked out. He kept trying to advise in that regard. But when the war broke out in 2003, he was asked, is this legal? Is this not legal? And he kept trying to say, this is not in conformity with the UN Charter, because if the Security Council does not authorize the use of force, then it's not legal, unless it's in self-defense after having been attacked. And neither of those things were in this case. And finally, he got pushed one day by a journalist from BBC, where he kept trying to say it's not in conformity with the UN Charter. And they said, well, doesn't that mean it's illegal? And I think he finally said, yes, okay, it's not legal. But then he got into a lot of trouble with the U.S. for having said that.
Speaking of wars, the world remembers the horrific conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, and I think nearly 800,000 people were killed in that horrific conflict.
Yeah.
And so often the United Nations was blamed for that, but in reality it was individual countries within the United Nations that would not allow the UN to send in peacekeepers. And the UN, I remember former President Bill Clinton of the United States went to Rwanda after he left office to apologize for not participating more in providing peacekeepers. But we have a little bit of video on this. We're going to watch this for about a minute. Let's watch it, listen to it, and we'll come back and talk about it. Let's roll the video.
Okay, good.
The international community could not muster the resources or the will to come to the aid of the Rwandese people as quickly as we would have. And as the General Dallaire said, at the critical time, if he had had 5,000 soldiers, one reinforced brigade, he could have made a lot of difference.
Gene, have we learned from the Rwanda experience? Did something come out of that maybe made the world say, just as with the Holocaust, never again? Or it's something, I know the responsibility to protect, R2P came out of it, but how does that apply today, what happened in Rwanda, to what we're doing today?
Yeah, right. And I'll just say a couple of things about that history, in that right before Rwanda and the genocide broke out, we had the incident in Somalia. And the U.S. lost 18, 19 soldiers in a raid that they had undertaken unsuccessfully. And this was televised all over the world. And Americans said, why are we there? So Clinton came up with a policy that we aren't going to intervene if there's no, national interest. So they didn't want to see it as genocide in Rwanda, which only happened a few months later. So Kofi Annan was profoundly affected by this. And he really, when he first came into office, organized discussions on humanitarian intervention. And when we had East Timor and Kosovo in 1999, he really launched into the need for the UN to get involved in humanitarian intervention. And then that concept evolved into the report, the responsibility
R2P,
to
which is
protect.
so important. Gene, these are very important issues, and I wish we had more time.
Okay.
But we'll have to come back later and talk about it. I want to thank you, Dr. Gene Krasno, for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.